Welcome back again, listeners. We're so glad you made it to another episode of Arts and Crimes. Arts and Crimes. I'm Kelly. You guys take so long. Okay, ready?
I'm not sure which one's going to go first.
Yeah, we got to rock, paper, scissors for it first. Ready?
Okay, ready?
Smash. So you go first?
No, you go first.
Okay. I'm Kelly.
All right. I'm Brandon.
And I'm Josh.
And we're collectively Arts and Crimes.
Kelly's Arts and Crimes. We're co-hosts, guest co-hosts.
You're just here.
Yeah. I like those Muppets, the hecklers.
Mm-hmm.
What are those guys' names?
Marley and Marley.
I literally was like, I only know them as Marley and Marley from the Muppet Christmas Carol. Somebody's listening to this and knows their name.
Yeah, they're yelling at us right now.
Yeah, yelling.
How can you not know?
In the comments, please. Are there comments on these?
It's only Michaela.
Yeah.
Michaela, in the comments, please tell us what the Muppets are named.
Perfect. So yes, we'll look into that in the future, and then we'll know. But I won't retroactively put that in the pod. But if you go to the Instagram, Michaela will leave that information for you.
Excellent.
Oh yeah, I forgot to say. I should say that Arts and Crimes has an Instagram that is in tandem with the pod. So every time I release an episode, I also post on the Instagram, and it has pictures that are related to the episodes because it's arts. So
that seems like a really helpful thing. You should have mentioned it earlier.
Like 5 episodes ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should have. I didn't. Okay, so back to the matter at hand. Today's episode, we're going to talk about World War II, but very specifically, the Ghost Army of World War II.
Ah.
So, you know them? Yeah, that was a sound of recognition.
Yeah, it's the same thing as in Lord of the Rings, right?
No.
And they brought the sword, and they were like, "This is my sword," and then they all went, "Whoa!" And they had to follow him.
No, but that would have been very cool.
And then he jumped out of a boat, and they all came through the boat after him. Mm-hmm. And he jumped out of the boat, and all the orcs were like, this is just one dude. And then it was like, oh no, it's Ghost!
Wasn't that such a cool cinematic moment in the movies?
Yeah.
In the theaters? Oh my gosh.
I don't think I know either of the things you're talking about.
Have you watched The Lord of the Rings?
I mean, maybe.
No.
What?
I can't believe.
Listen.
I watched some.
This is a crime against art.
Yeah, we have a 12-hour homework assignment with you now.
Oh my gosh.
Next week, our watch party for Lord of the Rings will be a 12-hour long version of this.
Because we have to get to the Ghost Army part, and that's at the end.
Yeah. There's a part where a bunch of ghosts jump out of a boat.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's in the movie, not in World War II. Just so you know, to clarify.
I got to keep these two ghost stories straight.
Army in World War II is obviously inspired by.
Yeah, I mean,
Which happened first?
The Ghost Army of World War II happened before the movies. When was the book written in like the 50s, 60s?
Listen, it happened during the
30s?
Middle Ages.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't there some... It's not Middle Earth. Middle Earth's the name of the place. It was the Second Age or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
It's way before World War II.
The Ghost Army, not only was it real, historically real.
There was real ghosts?
There was not real ghosts, but it was actually inspired by a previous battle. Okay, so here's what the Ghost Army was. The Ghost Army was a tactical deception unit that was utilized during World War II.
A TDU.
Or you could call that. I don't think they ever did, though.
A tactical deception unit.
And so...
You gotta stay all in TDUs from now on. Tell us about this TDU, Kelly.
I sure will. So World War II is happening, and the idea for it was sort of really put in play after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Before that, in 1942, the Battle of El Alamein, the British units in that battle actually utilized some deception tactics. It was very small amount of deception tactics. They used dummies and camouflage to mask the actual troop movements during that battle. And it was fairly successful. And so after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was sort of a need to help prepare and protect Allied forces because they were realizing that we weren't really ready for like an all-out assault on the German front lines. So they came up with this idea, and then Christmas Eve of 1943, they got the go-ahead. And so in January 20th of 1944, it was officially created. And so what the Ghost Army consisted of was sort of 4 different arms of that functioned to create this company. So the first was the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion Special, and it was the largest of the 4 companies, and it had 379 men. Their units were used specifically for visual deceptions, and it was comprised entirely of artists, set designers, fashion designers, engineers, that kind of stuff. So these units were specially created with hand-picked men from all over the United States and throughout the serving areas.
Yeah. Well, when you're like fashion, when you said they're handpicked from all over, and I thought you were going to say like the San Francisco area or something, you know?
Mostly, I think like the New York area. Actually, there was like a school there that they picked a lot of people from.
Oh, that's cool.
Like an art school. And so this group used an array of like inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, artillery, jeeps. They did all of this stuff to sort of fool aerial reconnaissance was kind of the idea behind most of what they did. And so they would do like flybys over their practice areas to see like how the shadows were looking and if everything was working right. And when you have actual tanks like in a field, they leave big heavy treads, and obviously these inflatable tanks, which are only like 95 pounds, aren't leaving behind big treads. So they would drive around where they were leaving their fake tanks with a bulldozer that had like stuff welded onto the wheels to make it look like tank treads. And so they'd like bulldoze around and then like plop their little fake tank at the end of where they put this line of like smashed grass and stuff. Also, it included some really famous artists like Ellsworth Kelly, which he has a great last name. He was a painter and a sculptor. There's Bill Blass, who was a fashion designer, and Art Kane, who was a photographer. They are all included in this 603rd kind of camouflage.
These are all fantastic names. Why isn't there a movie about these guys?
I don't know, because like Art is his name. It's fantastic. Also, a fun fact about this unit was that they are rumored to have had the highest average IQ of any of the military battalions and companies, with their average IQ at 119.
It's pretty good. So, go ahead.
It doesn't seem like that it would be very hard. I mean, there were a bunch of thinky type people that they put together to do a job that you wouldn't normally give soldiers.
I think the reason why it was so surprising, like people found that to be a surprising statistic, was because a lot of the men from other like battalions, and when they worked with these men, they like looked at them kind of like nutcases because they were like always sketching and drawing when they were out there, and they didn't act like the typical like war minded guy, and so they kind of often sort of stuck out in ways that was like not as accepted. And so often they had this assumption that because they weren't this standard military guy, that they also weren't as intelligent or as capable as soldiers. So I think that's why it kind of stood out.
So when you're talking about them like doing the flybys, so is this while they were developing the idea? So they had like a bulldozer and a bunch of inflatable tanks, and what else? Inflatable.
They had, by the end, they had inflatable like trucks, tanks. They had bulldozers. They had inflatable aircraft. They had dummies, like human dummies, and inflatable like artillery units, like those big cannon things. So they had inflatables of all of those.
And so what you're talking about is just testing it out.
Yeah. So the very first, and I'll explain it a little more in just a second, but when they first get called, they have 3 months to figure this all out. Which this unit, along with the radio unit, gets dispatched before the sound unit because of they needed longer to test stuff. So let me explain the units. So they had the camouflage battalion, which was visual deception. And then there was the Signal Company. It was called the Signal Company Special, which was 296 men. And it was for radio deception specifically. And they often called it spoof radio. And so the operators were creating fake traffic, impersonating radio operators from real units. And the lengths that they had to go to impersonate these other radio operators. So I was reading about it, and the radio operators, each radio operator had its own mannerism of sending its messages, primarily through Morse code. But often they would start things differently. The way that they would tap messages was different. Like some were faster, some were slower. They had like a canter, and they related it to having a very specific type of handwriting and like manner of speech. So like some operators would start their message every time with like 4 dots, and then they would go, right? And then others would use like shorthand and would like do very quick short messages but more frequently, while others would do longer messages but less frequently. And so these radio guys would have to go in and learn all of the idiosyncrasies of all of these different radio traffickers from all these different military units that they impersonated, and then recreate it perfectly. Because 75%, this is what they estimated later, like historians, 75% of German intel was taken from radio noise. And so they got very, very good at identifying who was running what radio. And so like the Germans that were listening could listen to how a radio guy is sending messages and know that he's from like the 96th platoon or whatever. And so the Signal Company had to be able to mimic that perfectly, or the Germans would notice. And they're always listening because most of their intel came from radio stuff. And so they had to figure all of that out and then mimic it, which is just like nuts. And the next company was the Signal Service Company Special, and this was for sonic deception, and it was a unit of 145 men. And the way that this was different from the radio group was that they specifically were tasked with sound effects. Because if you wanted people to believe that there was tanks there, you couldn't just have the inflatable tanks, you needed the sound of tanks. And oftentimes, like during the night, which is often when they're running in full force, they wanted to have the sounds of tanks moving, of battalions moving, of people like living. And so this is why this group kind of left second after the first group, because they had to record all the different types of tanks that we had. And we had to record it going uphill and downhill and like over hard terrain or soft terrain. And they had to record it in like what appeared to be windy conditions or rainy conditions or snowy conditions to try and mimic all of that. Because if they were in an area that was very like up and downhill and their tanks were mimicking sounds of tanks just going over flat surfaces, then again, the German troops that were listening in would know that something was up. Because it didn't sound right.
Okay, but I have a question about that. Because it seems like they're really trying to get like this extremely high level of verisimilitude for the audio, right? Mm-hmm. But you'd think if someone was close enough to hear it, they could just look and be like, oh, that's a inflatable tank. Like...
So they, like, really when you look at them, a lot of them the pictures are incredibly accurate. But the thing is like real troops were hiding a lot of their tanks and a lot of their stuff anyways. So you're not like walking into a battalion. And so you just have to be close enough to kind of see, but then you can hear, because you have like all of these like radio signals and antenna signals and whatever it is that they're listening to that they can pick up from a distance without having to see. And especially at night when things aren't lit up, like they don't have like infrared and stuff like that at this time. And so they're relying a lot more on sound than they are for any kind of visual stuff.
Interesting.
But the other thing that was really cool that they did was they recorded all this stuff and then they used a new a new recording device, because before they had like records. But the problem with that is that they are known for skipping, especially if you're trying to like drive anywhere with them. And there was this new way of recording that was done on like a wire, and I don't understand it. I didn't look it up. It just was the next thing after records, but it was incredibly new at this time, so much so that it wasn't used like outside of the military at that point. It was so new. And the great thing about it is it didn't skip. So they could play all this stuff, and nobody really had anything before the war or during the war that played sounds that didn't skip. So it was even more authentic because they're not hearing like any skips or anything like that in the audio, which was cool. And then the fourth kind of, arm of this unit was the 406th Engineer Combat Company, which is essentially their like armed guard. And they would patrol the, like the perimeter of any of their deception operations to make sure people didn't wander in and find these tanks were fake, or anything like that. And they were kind of the only ones with actual guns and with actual soldier training, really. Some of these men had been fighting before and were taken into the group. But some of them were drafted like straight into this group. So they hadn't really had any other military experience. And altogether, it was only 1,100 men.
But what if they sent a tank battalion to take out this battalion of tanks that they noticed?
That was the risk with it. Like, it was a very real risk, because their entire idea was deception. And this is something that they commented on. They are the only military force that was entirely deception, because they'd done deception missions before. Like, every war has done them. But typically it's like a portion of a group would go and do some sort of deception and then rejoin the group. So it was never an actual unit that was trained just for deception, that was wholly their purpose, and they could get up and move and go anywhere that they needed to implement this deception. And so that was the benefit of them, but it was very high risk. So kind of a high risk, high reward sort of idea behind the group. And so they all went into it knowing that either they would be very good at their jobs and successful, or they would all die. Like, that was kind of the option.
Well, they could be very good at their jobs and be successful and also die.
I mean, yeah, that's also true.
So it's not either or.
Yeah. But generally the idea was either they were really good and they didn't end up getting killed, or, they got found out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this 1,100 men was designed mostly to, like we said, to draw the attention to them. And so they were like under fire frequently, but because they could take better shelter than, they didn't actually have to fire back. But they still were at very, very high risk. The other good thing about their group, the other thing about their group is because they were kept so secret, they were required to not only be secret from the enemy, but from all allied forces as well. So Americans, the British, anybody did not know that they were part of this like deception team.
So did they ever did they ever have reports to actual fighting units about them as if they were their own fighting unit, or were they just completely unknown by the Allies? Did that question make sense? So,
did the Allies report and be like, "Hey, there's this army over here"?
Well, so what I guess what I mean is I'm a frontline nobody in a regal fighting battalion. Do I think we're here, the 42nd whatever we are, and over here is that unit, and then over there is another unit, and I think it's a real unit, but it's actually the ghost.
Yeah, so that
army.
Actually does happen. It does. And I actually have, in the order of missions, it's one of their first missions that causes a real big problem that they have to learn from. And so I'll also answer that. You guys are asking such good questions, but I am going to answer them in just a second. Or I hope I do. But yeah, that exact problem comes up because they're kept secret from everybody. Because what they were afraid, the generals and everybody in charge was afraid that if any of the allies knew, they're human. Somebody's going to tell somebody, and it's going to get out. And if that gets out, then the whole thing is ruined. And they don't want to do that. So they kept it a secret from everybody. In fact, this information wasn't declassified until 1996.
They really didn't want anybody to know.
Yeah, they did not. And the reason they didn't declassify it till 1996 was because they were like, this was so successful, we might use it again, and we don't want people to know about it.
Let's get those inflatable tanks out.
Yeah.
We have a modern battle, and then all these inflatable World War II tanks. We've been practicing for 50 years. It's the same guys.
The same unit.
We've perfected our craft.
Yeah. What's great is there's another section after this added during this next thing. It's great. They're like such a great group. So I was kind of like inspired to talk about this after we watched that movie with
Lord of the Rings.
That friggin' ghost boat.
No, the like something of ungentlemanly warfare.
Oh, the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare.
Yeah, that's it. Because they sort of did things under the radar. It was sort of their own deception thing.
Yeah, and also only very recently declassified, which is nuts.
Yeah, so it's sort of like in the same arena, and so I thought it'd be fun to do. So in January they get created, and they're doing all of the testing, and they're doing aerial runover and that kind of stuff, and then they get their first mission, and basically. So they go out and they're supposed to carry out like 3 practice deceptions. And there's not really a lot said about them, except for that they went out and practiced deceiving somebody, I guess, like a minor troop. But what I do know is that they were codenamed Cabbage, Cheese, and Spam. Fun names. I actually really liked all of their like silly code names, so I tried to remember them.
Well, they're a very creative bunch.
So the kind of the heart of the original idea that they had for their first mission was to distract forces for the D-Day assault in Normandy. But I was reading it because in multiple places it referenced that they were initially created to be this kind of D-Day support. But D-Day came and they were not employed. Or deployed or whatever. They didn't get used on D-Day. But
did they say why? Like, were they not ready, or it didn't fit into the plan? I
don't know if like it just didn't fit in the plan, or if it was like too high risk or something. Because it didn't say. But what it did say was shortly after D-Day, they were called in just like a very small unit of 15 men to head to Normandy with dummy artillery just ahead of the rest of the Ghost unit to sort of like start implementing the idea of additional forces coming that weren't actually coming.
Yeah, you'd think it wouldn't work for an invasion, because if there were a place where they could safely move in an entire battalion of fake tanks and load them up on this heavily defended beach, they'd probably want to use that portion to just send the real tanks in.
Yeah, I mean, probably this is more like tricking them that these units are moving somewhere.
Yeah,
right?
which generally is how they're used, or like to like, you know, draw fire while a battalion moves in or out. And so this actual mission that they were asked to do was the Ghost Army was sent to support the 908th position and draw fire to them, so that the 908th artillery could move for their real attack. So it was more to just like draw fire from the 908th while they went and did what they really needed to do.
Was this their first actual mission?
This was their first actual mission.
What was the code name?
I actually think I maybe didn't write down the code name of this one.
So it wasn't as good as Cabbage or Cheese.
Yeah, clearly not.
As good as Spam.
Yeah, none of those ones. It must have been something really boring.
Biscuit.
Do you think they like set it up and then they go to turn on their speakers, and they're like, all right, everyone run away. And because they're going to get shot.
Yeah.
So, like, set it up, blow everything up, hit the speaker button, and then let's go a mile down the road and just hunker down.
So it's funny because a lot, like when one of the books that I read for this, which is fantastic, and it had really great pictures in it because they're all constantly sketching. It was like a beautiful rendition of this like horrific war kind of thing. Anyways, they talked about how they had to dig their own foxholes to hide in. So I'm imagining, because they had like headquarters set up sort of back behind like the quote unquote front lines of what they're doing, but it seemed like they also had to dig foxholes and hide in those to maintain the illusion. Because even though the tanks were well built, because they had built them with multiple layers of inflatable sections, so that when they're peppered with shrapnel, they don't deflate instantly. I'm sure there was an amount of maintenance that had to happen, and so they did have to have guys out there. And they did talk about how they would sort of rotate, where some guys would be back doing like radio stuff and other stuff back behind, and then other units would be up in where they could potentially be shot. But in this first one, they just had 15 men come ahead of the rest of the group to start getting things set up and to kind of create that transition from the actual group into their group. And they flew into Normandy on a plane with a bunch of women. They were really surprised because it was a bunch of nurses getting flown in. So then they landed in Normandy and it was actually a nearby town, which is French, and it's Sainte-Mère-Église. And I look at you because you speak French.
I mean, it sounds like you said Sainte-Mère-Église.
Is that?
I mean, Église is church.
Okay.
Mère.
Mère is
mother,
horse.
right? M-E-R-E.
Yeah.
Mère Église, yeah. Mother church. I don't know. Saint would be saint. I mean, while we're doing the full French lesson here. Sainte-Mère-Église.
Sainte-Mère-Église.
Good job.
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent.
Perfect. So they went to this nearby town and they set up
Sainte-Mère-Église.
And they set up kind of in the farms around it. And it was their first mission, and it was successful. They drew fire from the 980th, and they were able to do the things they needed to do.
Okay, this sounds like Kung Pao. They're like, I'm getting shot, meaning I'm doing my job.
Yeah. I'm bleeding, making me the victor. So they did a great job. But there were a couple slip-ups. One of which was...
they realized that all of their tanks were inflatable, and if they get a hole in them, they collapse.
No.
Why didn't we think of this before?
They planned for that with the multiple inflatable parts.
Weren't you listening?
This
Again,
is
not listening. No matter how many inflatable parts there are, if they're riddled with bullets, they will deflate.
It's true. It's a risk they ran. But the real problem was that some people and animals got through their perimeter of like, don't look at our deception. So one farmer went out to his field, which was now filled with inflatable tanks, but they looked very, very real. And so he was entirely surprised to find that his cow could push around this huge tank because it was just like pushing it out of the way. And he was like, what the heck? And then
super cow. How do you say super cow in French?
Vache super.
Vache super.
So they had to like...
Sacre bleu. I'm just going to keep saying French. Give me some more French to say. What else would this farmer say?
Je suis laid.
Je suis laid.
That means I'm ugly.
Oh, no. I walked right into it.
Zing bang.
Self-burn.
So they had to like track down this farmer and like swear him to secrecy, I guess. I don't know what. They just said that they had to make sure he didn't say anything.
Don't tell anybody.
Yeah, and he was
That's kind of menacing, though. They're
a little bit.
We need to silence him.
Yeah, but these guys like were so nice. They were like, just promise. And then they left.
You can tell people in 1996.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we'll be cleared. And then there was another instance where somebody walked up and the men didn't realize that, like the Ghost Army men didn't realize that there was a person there that shouldn't have been. And so 4 of them just like picked up one of the tanks to move it. And the guy was like, what? Because it's a tank. And in broken French, the only thing that he did, because like there's a bunch of quotes from the actual men in this book, which is another reason why it's fantastic. And he was like, the only thing that I could like say to him in broken French was like, Americans are very strong. And that was it.
Je suis Captain America.
Essentially. But other than those, I don't even know what happened.
That was a high five. Because I said French correctly.
Good job.
Je suis Captain Americain.
Anyways, so after they had the Captain America moment and it was successful, their colonel that was kind of over the everything, his name was Harry L. Reeder, and he wrote about the mission. He said, the attitude of the 23rd, because that's what they were called, the 23rd unit, the attitude of the 23rd HQs towards their mission is lopsided. There is too much military and not enough showmanship. Like it or not, the 23rd HQ must consider itself a traveling roadshow ready at a moment's notice to present the 2nd Armored Division by Brooks, the 9th Infantry Division by Eddy, the 7th Corps by Collins. The presentation must be done with the greatest accuracy and attention to detail. They will include the proper scenery, props, costumes, principals, extras, dialogue, and sound effects. We must remember that we are playing to a very critical and attentive radio, ground, and aerial audience. They must be convinced.
It was really playing into Brandon's theory for how the movie should go. The show must go on.
Yeah, it could be a musical.
Yeah.
Which was really funny because Reed was reported to be sort of like a stick in the mud, like many of the generals that were put in charge of this were sort of disappointed that this was their assignment because they wanted to be in charge of like
actual tanks
and actual guns and go in and actually like go and fight the enemy. And so even though he was in charge, he was often called like not an imaginative guy. And so I thought this was really funny what he said. He probably said it in like a very serious way.
That was the sickest burn they could think of.
Yeah.
They're like, you're so unimaginative.
From a group of creatives.
Yeah, that's the worst they could do.
Yeah. So they they were sufficiently burned. And then they got their next mission August 9th. And the new mission called Operation Brittany, they were to give the impression that Americans were weakening their forces in front lines of the main battle position and turning west to clear the Brittany Peninsula, when General Patton was actually racing around to the east to surround the Germans from the east side. So more than 80 inflatable tanks were used, but like it says, even though they used 80 inflatable tanks, radio was the primary form of deception, since they were moving away from the front lines and they were less visible at this point. Also, there's a historian, Jonathan Gahn, who believes that this might have been one of the most important Ghost Army deceptions, because it allowed Patton to come around and essentially flank the German force in France. And what's interesting is the Ghost Army found Patton to be one of the easiest generals to work with. And so they ended up he utilizes them multiple times, more than any other group. He sort of like has it in his pocket that he has this sort of deception team and utilizes them multiple times.
So he knew what to do with them, basically.
Yeah, he saw the value.
Yeah, exactly. Which is funny because he also had sort of a reputation of being this like, he was all about like fighting and being up front, and he was like gruff and mean, but worked incredibly well with this group. And like you said, saw the value. And one of the other very important successes that they learned from this particular battle was an additional manner of deception that they hadn't anticipated that they would use. And Brandon, you're really going to like this. It's theatrics. So there was a guy, his name was Fred Fox, and he was an aspiring actor at the time, but ended up writing baby food commercials for the radio, which like didn't exactly get him what he wanted.
Because babies can't even understand the radio.
Yeah.
What's the point?
What, like, why are you even doing that? But he had like a very theatrical background, and he convinced the generals that it was really important for them to not just run this deception on the field, but they should be utilizing all aspects of military life, which included going into town and involving themselves at bars and with people there, and like driving through the town. And
he's like, listen, we have to visit the brothels several times.
All the time.
Yes.
So they would disguise their Jeeps with the markings of certain patrols they were trying to mimic, or different units that they were trying to mimic. And they would make and then sew the patches onto their uniforms. And they would even impersonate generals, which was a court-martial offense if anybody found them that was American. And so they would go into town and they would pretend to be these military units, and they would get drunk, and then they would accidentally slip little hints of information, like that they have reinforcements, or that they're moving out, or whatever it was that they were trying to do with their deception. And they, like, I think somewhere in the writing he said they let us loose on the town, because they would go and like pull absolute shenanigans. Like one town they were in, they found one of the bars was owned by a German conspirator, and it was like a known conspirator, and he would always send information. And so they purposely broke into his bar wearing the military uniform of the military unit they were impersonating, and stole all of his best, most expensive wine and left so that he would report to the Germans that this unit was there because they just broke in and stole all his wine. And then other times they would
Can't you just see that conversation? All this stuff is, again, I'm like, Brandon, we need to make your movie. Okay, so Fred Fox. Remember the scene in Arrested Development when Tobias is trying to become the play director for the high school play?
Yes.
And he's like talking to the football coach or whatever. Oh no, he's talking to the principal who has the football coach. And he's like, and he does it in rhyming, and he's so proud of. That's what I'm picturing Fred Fox doing to the generals.
Yeah.
And then yes, we have the smash cut to the guys pilfering all the wine, and then we see the guy in French so mad calling the Germans. They stole it's the 97th, and they are freaking wine stealers. Kill them and bring me back my wine.
Yeah, and they like did that kind of stuff all the time to like such an extent. They would sew multiple patches onto the same shirt so that in the same night while they were out, they could rip off layers of patches and pretend to be different units, like walking around and commingling. And then they also would figure out, like learn what songs a particular troop liked to sing. So if men had a favorite song, then they would learn the song, and then when they got quote unquote drunk, they would sing that song at the bar because they're like, oh, it's that third unit always singing that song. And they would find out if a unit liked to play like baseball on their off days, and they would go play baseball where people could see it, so that they would be reinforcing this idea that it was that same group of men.
So they were real method actors.
Yeah, really.
They got into the character.
And there was a couple times where they ran into like American troops, and it was awkward. Like there was Sergeant Jack McGlynn. He was driving a Jeep with the 19th Infantry Division marking, and he ran into the real 19th Division at a checkpoint. And this was during the time of the Battle of the Bulge. And the Germans had at this time kind of unleashed their own secret units of soldiers dressed as Americans, like in American uniforms. And so the soldiers at all these checkpoints were at like high alert. And so McGlynn is asked, what's the password? And he's like, I don't know. And the checkpoint officer is like, what's last month's password? And McGlynn was like, I don't know. I've never had a password. And the guy was like, gun in McGlynn's face, ready, like he thought he caught a German trying to sneak in. And he was like, where are you from? And McGlynn was like, Boston. And the guy was like, I'm reading their quotes. It's amazing. Boston's a big place. Where? And McGlynn says, Medford. And then the other guy's all, what's the name of the school on Harvard Street? And McGlynn goes, the Lincoln School. They had lived within 5 blocks of each other. Like, the odds of that happening is insane. So the guy let him go because he knew the name of the street. So he was an American. And they had stuff like that happen a few times where they ran into Americans and had to, like, trick them. So yeah, they learned to do that in that mission. So not only was Operation Brittany successful, but they kind of learned this new skill and implemented it for the rest of the time. So
And the skill was theatrics. I'm doing jazz hands. You can't see.
they were really good jazz hands. So then they were, I want to see if I wrote down the code name for this one. Maybe I didn't because I figured you guys would like the name of the town. So they were dispatched to Brest in the middle of August.
Oh. All right. I'll do this part because I'm super... All right.
Mature.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for rejoining us here on Arts and Crimes. In the next mission, the TDU was dispatched to Brest, France. There they were tasked with inflating the numbers of the American soldiers. That's as far as he got.
So they were inflating the size of the American forces attacking the city by impersonating the 6th Armored Division in the hopes that it would help convince German General Hermann Bernhard Ramke to surrender. Ramke? Anyways, they were trying
How's
to trick...
it spelled?
Ramcke.
Yeah, I think you had it.
So basically they wanted to try and inflate their numbers so that they could get him to surrender. And they set up tanks, and the tanks actually had, because they were so close to the front lines on this one, the tanks had a system where the men could click a button and then they had to like get out of there because the tanks would blow, because they didn't want any of the Germans finding any of this information and possibly piecing together that they had this deception unit. And so they had everything set up. They had all the radio traffic going. They lit fires. They pitched tents, like everything to make it look like they were there. And they could actually see German observers watching from a church tower. They were that close that they could see them. However, this is where the mission did not go as planned, and kind of what you were talking about earlier, Bran. Because of the secret nature of the Ghost Army, the Allies didn't know about them. And so the Americans erroneously thought that forces were reinforcing them there. And so they came in and attacked right where the Ghost Army had been trying to convince the Germans that men were at.
That probably sent a weird message to the Germans.
that the army was actually there.
The Americans are fighting each other.
Well, they didn't think that. The Germans, they thought that there was an army there. Mm-hmm. And then they started attacking. And so the Ghost Army was like, well, we can't fight back, so we have to get out of here. So they leave. But the Americans had already started coming to join that area because they thought that they had 80 tanks sitting there.
The Americans thought that the Ghost Army was American reinforcements.
Yes, they did.
Oh, so they're like, let's get in there, guys.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And so they came in thinking that they were being reinforced by 80 tanks. And as you can imagine, things didn't go well, because the Ghost Army pulled out and there wasn't actually 80 tanks there, and the Americans that thought they were being reinforced were not reinforced, and so there was heavy casualties. And so it was a problem that obviously weighed heavy on the entire group, because I'm sure they felt partially responsible.
Yeah.
So it was something that they wanted to make sure never happened again. So communication processes were changed for any further operation that they had. And it didn't say exactly how they were changed, but it was something that they were very careful with after this mission because it did end so poorly. But the next mission was again helping General Patton, and this one was called Operation Bettenberg. And so after a disorganized flight through France, the German troops began to sort of reorganize themselves. But the problem was that Patton realized he had a 70-mile gap in his troops to the north. And if the Germans found out about that 70-mile gap, then they could easily get through. And so Patton called the Ghost Army and told them that they needed to essentially cover this 70 miles. So this 1,100 men had to convince the onlooking Germans that the 70-mile gap was filled. And it was one of their most risky deceptions because, again, it was right up at the front lines. So there was a high risk of not only the deception failing, but then them potentially getting entirely wiped out. And so the visual deception team was actually on a minimal use for this one because, again, the Germans had been kind of exiting and there weren't as many planes flying over, so aerial reconnaissance was not a big deal. But the sonic and radar deception was hugely important to make sure that was maintained and done well. And this operation was supposed to only last 2 days. And they set up like fake radio networks. They had 3 fake ones and 2 real ones. They had men in the towns nearby marked as the 6th Armored Division, and they were doing all of their typical deceptions. But the 83rd unit that was supposed to come and fill that gap ended up getting delayed. And so the Ghost Army had to stay in this position as Germans continued to get closer and closer for 4 days instead of 2. They had to manage to keep up this deception. And it was increasingly harder to keep the deception. But, I mean, they did everything they could, and it actually was very successful. But as they were pulling out, they realized how close they were to being caught because they heard shots coming from the nearby woods, so just right outside their camp. And when they were, like, cleaning, like, getting all their stuff, they found that several of the signal wires that they had laid out were cut. So Germans had actually gotten in and were cutting wires. Like, they were so close. But it was a success. They were able to keep anybody from crossing that 70 miles and you know, allow for those troops to come in without there being any issues. And then the next one was in December, and it was Operation Koblenz. And there was heavy fighting up to the north as the Allies captured the German city of Aachen. And then there was a really bloody attack that followed in Hurtgen Forest. Hurtgen Forest?
Hurricane Forest.
It did sound very like... It's H-U with the 2 dots above it. I don't know what that does. Yeah, I don't know what it does.
In French,
it makes it more German.
Yeah, essentially.
It is in French though, but it makes you pronounce the vowels above.
So
like
Hurtgen.
I'm not good at remembering words that were spelled out loud to me. So
I don't think I even spelled it out loud.
Good.
Yeah. At any rate, so further south there was a 90-mile stretch of the front, so where the battle was happening, along the Audacious forest that was being held by only 4 American divisions, and they weren't holding it well. I mean, they were holding it well, but it was like, you know, they were having a hard time. It wasn't easy. And so the Ghost Army was brought in to help kind of bolster that line. And the mission, again, was to impersonate the 75th Infantry Division moving into the area northeast of Luxembourg City. And the idea was that it would prevent Germans from transferring troops out of that area and maybe force them to take troops away from the Hurtgen Forest to deal with the with the threat of the 75th. So they were trying to divert some German troops. And additionally, they hoped to convince the Germans that the 75th was about to attack across the river Sauer. Sauer.
Sour.
So shortly after arriving by jeep, they went to do like a fake reconnaissance, and bullets immediately started flying overhead. And so the guys from the Ghost Army like booked it, and they found that the Germans in that area were not as docile as they had hoped. And in fact, were incredibly fierce. And that early that morning in December, the Germans launched a massive counterattack. And retreat was sort of the only option that not only the Ghost Army, but the Allied forces had. And so much so that some of the Ghost Army men actually got on machine guns and were firing at the planes, the German planes that were flying above town. It was one of the very few times that those men actually got to fire actual weapons at the actual enemy. Because normally they're inflated artillery. And so this is the area of Luxembourg. It became very overrun. And so there was a meeting of generals to kind of discuss plans and tactics. And General Patton was in the group. And the meeting was interrupted with a phone call. The Ghost Army that had sort of been separated because most of the Ghost Army was sent to leave when they retreated, but there was a portion of them, of the radio ones, that were sent in a different direction, and they got caught up in the German forces and were sort of surrounded with another group of American soldiers. And they patched themselves into this meeting by finding loose telephone wires in a barn and cobbled together the correct stuff somehow, then patched themselves into the meeting so that the generals could speak to the general that was there, that was, surrounded by the German troops, and these like Ghost Army radio guys that were with them. And so it was decided by the generals that they were like, look, if you can stay. If you can't leave, if you can't stay, go ahead and leave, and we're not going to get mad at you. And the general decided to stay, and they actually held out till reinforcements showed up. Which allowed those men that were trapped, the Ghost Army men that were trapped, to evacuate. And so they, even though they were like in a pretty, scary spot there, they managed to survive it and then rejoin with their Ghost Army leader. But back in that meeting, Patton was trying to figure out any kind of movement or anything that they could do to sort of conceal his movement. And he called again upon the Ghost Army. And for this mission, it was a really quick, just radio-only deception, and it only lasted 24 hours. And the idea was that they would broadcast a bunch of fake radio calls while Patton and the other generals were broadcasting real radio calls so that the Germans wouldn't know which ones were real. And because of this double exposure to orders, they codenamed this one Operation Kodak, which I thought was cute. But anyways, it worked, and it allowed Patton's Third Army to break through the German ring around Bastogne and connect with the 101st Airborne. So it allowed them, Patton was allowed to get through to an area that he wouldn't have been able to. Other ways. And then this next one is the saddest of the missions because for the most part they did a fantastic job and didn't have any casualties except for this next mission. It was Operation Bouzonville, and they were impersonating the 80th Infantry Division, and they were pretending to prepare an attack near Sarlatern in order to decoy Germany away from the attack further north. So again, they were another decoy group. And it was only 33 hours. It was like one of their shorter missions. And it went really well until the last few hours. And in those last few hours, the German artillery opened up on them and just, covered the area in artillery, and shrapnel was everywhere. And they talked about how a shell would hit in front of their truck and then the truck behind them, and like this, little group would be fine. And one of the radio men, his truck was hit, and he was hit with a whole bunch of shrapnel. And when men went to go save him, he was quoted as saying, "Don't bother, I'm going to die," and made them leave to safety. And then moments later, he died, I guess. 2 additional men died. So 3 men in total died, and 15 additional men were wounded. And some super severely. There was one guy, and Brandon, I'm almost adding this part for you because I don't know if you're going to hate it or love it.
Oh boy.
But one guy was hit in the back with some shrapnel. I always say shrapnel and it's wrong. It's shrapnel. And it started to get infected, so they sent him to a hospital back in the States or whatever. And guess who visited this guy in the hospital and inspired him?
I don't know.
Picasso.
Oh my gosh. I never would have guessed that. Inspired him.
Yeah.
Inspired him to make crappy paintings.
Yeah, apparently he was very inspired by Picasso, and a lot of his late works reflect a lot of that, use of geometric lines and that kind of stuff. So, anyways.
I love the idea that this soldier gets sent back to the hospital, and normally they're like, bring in the beautiful women, or, something like, let's bring in the New York Yankees. And then someone's like, he's not like the rest of the soldiers.
Bring in Picasso.
We need Picasso.
Exactly, yeah.
What I think would be great if he was like, is it bad? Am I maimed? Draw me. And
he's like, I can't tell.
Here you go. And he's like, oh my gosh, I'm ugly.
So yeah, there you go. Picasso came and visited him in the hospital.
Okay, alternate punchline. Because what I thought you were going to say is that he was horribly maimed, but Picasso's like, you look good to me. His arm's in the wrong place. He's like,
I like what you've done with yourself.
Look amazing. And that inspired Picasso.
Yeah, that's where it's
Until that point, Picasso had only made realistic portraits.
Yeah, it's an actual portrait of that guy.
Yeah. Oh man, all this time I've been hating on him, but it was actually inspired by World War II, and I just should have been really more understanding.
Yeah,
Picasso's.
No, he was still kind of a terrible guy. But there's this one shining moment. Yeah, I mean, everybody has their good moments. So then came their final mission, and this was the Operation Viersen.
They really went downhill with the names from those first 3.
Yeah,
they did.
You thought they set a precedence.
The high point was for sure cabbage and cheese and Spam, because I don't like Kodak, though, I think was another shining moment.
A Kodak moment, perhaps?
Oh, sorry, I choked on that joke.
Okay, so here's what happened in their final operation. The Allies needed to cross the River Rhine, and the Ghost Army's job, again, was to fool Germans into thinking the planned attack would happen 10 miles south to where they were actually going to attack. So as the real division moved north, the Ghost Army sort of took over radio operations as they imitated the radios where they were taking over. And Sergeant Stanley Nance, he transmitted 30 different messages from 8 different locations to simulate the movement towards the front. He also made sure to match the power of his transmitter to the power of the one he was replacing. This I thought was so clever. So they didn't have equipment to measure the power output. And so what he did was a simple but effective trick. Is he would hold his pencil close to the antenna that the division radio was using and see how big the spark was. And then when he set his radio, he matched the size of the spark to make sure he was sending at the right power level, because he didn't want there to be a difference. And then the visual deception unit laid down smoke screens at the River Rhine near the town of Krefeld, as if they were trying to hide build up there. And they set up fake supply dumps, and they staffed phony headquarters. They inflated 200 decoy vehicles And that included tanks, trucks, and airplanes as well. And they put them in the forest, they put them in courtyards, and they also incorporated real armored vehicles to sort of add credence to the deception. And then the sonic unit worked day and night to reinforce all of the sounds and movements. And they included the sound of like people making bridges, as if they were going to bridge the water.
I like, that's got to be some very specific sounds, but they just include like a worker like, how's the bridge coming along, Joe? The bridge is we're making progress on this bridge, fellas.
Good thing we're a full army with lots of people here. This would be tough work. But yeah, they did all that kind of stuff. They even placed an army hospital in that area as if to like prepare for, the need for a hospital. And then on the morning of the attack, the Navy went to attack, and instead of the huge forces and resistance that they anticipated, they ran into very disorganized German troops, and only 31 men were lost in that entire battle for all of the American troops. So it was incredibly successful there at the end. So like ending on a high note there. And they were, like, after that, they were sent to go help kind of clean up. Like, after the war, they had to send a lot of troops out to sort of help maintain the disaster that was left behind. So all of the people that were left, like, homeless and starving, Holocaust victims, like, all that kind of stuff, they were having to help not only maintain that, but also protect any of the Germans left in the areas. Because these people that had been, like family members massacred and all this kind of stuff were attacking and killing any Germans they found. And so this ghost unit and other units alike had to go in and kind of like maintain order and also protect Germans, which was like weird for them.
Okay, so after World War II, the United States sent a bunch of engineers to Japan to help them rebuild their infrastructure and all of their manufacturing capabilities, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm just picturing Fred Fox going to Germany and all of these, like, people that were in the war and, like, orphans and stuff. And he's like, I will teach you the ways of the theater.
That's their specialty.
You are my King Lear. And he's, like, bringing them in.
This is my magnum opus.
Yeah, that would be the last episode. I've changed it now. It shouldn't be a movie. It should be a series. And the last episode is him setting up a theater in Berlin and teaching them
the arts.
Yeah.
It's like Band of Brothers, but like funny instead of tragic.
Yeah.
And then the unit was sworn to secrecy. They couldn't tell anyone about their military service. So when they got home, people were like, what did you do? And they're like,
Killed
stuff.
Nazis.
That's what we did. And it wasn't until 1996 that they were finally able to like tell their families and get on record what actually happened. So, yay.
That's crazy.
They did
nuts.
great.
Yeah.
Cut. We're done. I just thought it was so interesting because, like, when we watched that movie, the whatever, Ungentlemanly Warfare
Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare.
That's the one. It just kind of made me think of all the little tiny efforts that were all happening in all these other different areas, all culminating into the success that we achieved, and this is just like another one of them that was entirely secret. Like, these guys didn't know if anyone would ever know anything that they did, and they played huge parts in a couple really major battles, and people just like wouldn't know ever, potentially, as far as they knew, and so it just like the war is so profoundly sad, but at the same time, I just like feel such love and appreciation for the people that, thinking they'd never get recognition potentially, went out there and were like, I'm going to do this to the best of my abilities. And they found that their abilities were very artistic and managed to do something with it. Like, if I was part of a group, I would want to be part of this group. Like, that's, using the skills that you have in whatever way to better the world, I think is a beautiful thing. Like I tell my students, as artists and designers, we're not taking the Hippocratic Oath. We're not doctors, but we should do no harm, right? We shouldn't be creating art pieces to damage or to harm or to degrade, because art is something that is so lasting and so impactful that we can make such a huge difference to improve lives. And that's can be carried through generations and cultures from, hundreds of years ago, where we don't have anything about them besides their art. And I just really liked that this was a moment in history where that was used as like more than just like we make pretty things or we're documenting, but like we physically use these skills to save lives. I just thought that was really cool.
It is cool.
So stay in school and do art.
Doesn't it seem so rudimentary, like blow up tanks, that it would be so effective, right? But the world has progressed so quickly, right? Remember the very first episode we were talking about
Perugia.
Perugia stealing the Mona Lisa. And it's like, if they just had security cameras,
Yeah,
this wouldn't have worked, right?
Yeah.
And if they just had drones, or like you mentioned, infrared cameras, this wouldn't have worked, right?
Yeah.
So they just had the right stuff at the exact right moment to make a difference. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I just love the idea of them literally like scavenging to see what they can find and cobbling together this incredibly effective unit. Yeah. Props to them. Literal props, actually, now that I think about it. But
I also wondered if, they have a fake hospital. Do you think they would blow up fake victims in it? You said they had fake people.
They did have dummies, yeah. Maybe all of the dummies that got shot and deflated.
They put into the real hospital.
Deflated corpses.
Little beds full of deflated people.
They're like, finally they get the service they deserve.
And they patch it up.
Yeah.
And then one of the nurse falls for one of the deflated people.
Yeah. What is that episode of Futurama where he's like, she falls in love with the dummy? My two favorite things are commitment and changing myself.
Does that dummy have a brother?
Yes, exactly. So yeah, thank you guys for listening. I hope that was enjoyable. And I really appreciate that you guys actually like sit and listen to this stuff. I find it so fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks again for stopping by Arts and Crimes. And have a great rest of your day and weeks or whatever you're doing. Okay, bye.
See ya. They used their units for visual deception.
There's that weenus joke we were waiting for.
Oh, no.
Back on top. We're rolling. Keep going. We're in our groove.